and welcome. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. These are the words of Dr. Martin Luther King. There is no difficulty that enough love will not conquer, no disease that enough love will not heal, no door that enough love will not open, no gulf that enough love will not bridge, no wall that enough love will not throw down, no sin that enough love will not redeem. These are the words of Emmett Fox. Both these quotations frame the purpose of our being here. On behalf of President Louis V. Hinken in his absence, Provost Dr. Blair Lord, Vice Presidents, Deans, Directors, Chairs, faculty, staff, and students, we have come today to become empowered to make change as educational communities and the broader community as well, knowing that there is power in oneness. Margaret Mead argues, never doubt that a few powerful people can change the world. Indeed, it is the one thing that ever has. While diversity includes racism, sexism, feminism, and any other isms, the issue of diversity is an important one in our nation today. Often, it takes a speaker like Tim Wise to assist us with creating conversations on diversity and to let us know that it's okay. Today, Tim Wise is here to help us with this important endeavor. He is among the most prominent anti-racist writers and activists in the United States, having spoken in 48 states in over almost 400 colleges and campuses, including Harvard, Stanford, and law schools at Yale, Columbia, and Vanderbilt. He has trained teachers as well as corporate, government, media, and law enforcement officials on methods of dismantling racism in their institutions and has served as a consultant for plaintiffs' attorneys in the federal discrimination cases in New York and Washington State. Help me welcome Tim Wise to our campus.
I'm going to the middle one, right? Thank you. I guess among that list of all these wonderful prominent places where I've spoken, I should have probably adjusted the bio to say that I had been here before, because I had been, and certainly every bit as important a presentation as those at Harvard and all those other nice sounding places. So it's good to be back. It's been, I believe, about 4 or 5 years. And when we were talking about putting today together, I know that originally the idea was for a sort of informal, well, not really informal, somewhat formal workshop. And, you know, Mildred said, well, how many people do you like to have for a workshop? And I said, yeah, like 35. No more than that. And at first, that was cool. We had that covered, you know, and then we would do the big event in the evening, and that would be, you know, more people. And then she said, well, I think we have more than 35 coming. And I said, how many more? And I think at first it was maybe 60. And I said, all right, we might still be able to work with that. And then the other day, she said it had gotten up to 175. I don't think we have that many in here, but I will say that we have more than is possible to do a true workshop. So, and I'm sure you figured that out, because workshops, they don't put the podium up here, and there would be flip charts, and there would be, you know, so we're not doing that. But what that means is it's both bad and good. I mean, the bad aspect of it is that because it's not a workshop, you're not going to get to interact as much as you would. It's not going to be as much of a dialogue as it's going to be like a little bit of monologue, and then we're going to do Q&A. So you're not going to get involved as much as you would have otherwise. The good aspect of this is, even though I can talk for a long time, I'm not going to take up 3 hours of your time for a speech and Q&A. So we will probably unless you just have a whole lot of questions and the conversation gets extremely interesting, we're probably going to be able to get out of here before 4 o'clock, so I'm sure that won't bother me. Never seems to. Getting out early never seems to really make people angry. I am very glad to be back, and I'm very glad to be able to have this conversation about, well, the title of the talk. It's one I've been using for quite a few years now. It's not the one that I gave when I was here before. Beyond Diversity. The reason that I, several years ago, chose this title for the sort of stock presentation, or one of several stock presentations that I would give as I go around to colleges, was because, and I'm sure if you've been in this game for any real length of time, or even if you haven't been, to the extent you might even be new here teaching, you were certainly in school at a time when these conversations were being held on a lot of campuses. Conversations about diversity. And if you're like me, those conversations you probably got very exasperated with and very uptight over, and were never really quite pleased with. I certainly wasn't, and it's one of the reasons that I decided to talk about these issues in the way that I speak about them. I think that traditional diversity dialogue that we've become so accustomed to is flawed on at least 4 levels, and I want to speak about what those are very briefly before I talk about what I think the issues really are and what the issues really need to be in terms of our dialogues on campuses, in terms of how we speak about these issues on campuses, and then about how we go about undoing these problems that exist on campuses. That traditional diversity dialogue in higher education, and for that matter, not just higher ed, but even in the corporate world and in certain nonprofit agencies and governmental agencies around the country seem to do it very similar, is flawed on at least 4 levels. The first of which is that, and these are in no particular order of importance, the first of these is that typically when we talk about issues of diversity, we, being, let's say, a college or university, place an extraordinary amount of the focus and thus the limelight and thus the spotlight and thus the pressure on those who are defined in either racial terms, gender terms, sexual orientation terms, class terms, or whatever, as the other. That is to say, we focus all of our attention on those who were different from the so-called norm, and yet we never actually examine that so-called norm. In other words, we interrogate the other, we try to figure out what makes them tick, we try to understand them, maybe even appreciate them, or as the old sticker says, celebrate them, because we're going to celebrate diversity. It's a lovely little thought, right? The problem being that the thing we're going to celebrate is that otherness, but we're never going to interrogate that norm that gets taken for granted. It is simply assumed to be normal. It's not assumed to be a racially specific norm or a gender-specific norm or a class-specific norm or a norm only for certain people with certain sexual orientations. And so we place all of that attention on the other. We leave the norm untouched, unexamined, and unproblematized. I'll give you an example of what I mean and how this can indeed create problems. The first time I went to the state of Minnesota for a speech, and I want to say up front now, as a disclaimer, if any of you are from the state of Minnesota, please do not take this personally. I have found that people from Minnesota have extraordinarily thin skin, which is shocking for a place that's so cold. But it seems like whenever I say what I'm about to say, people are mightily offended, and not always. Some think it's quite funny. First time I went to Minnesota, which is a lovely state with a lot of lovely people. I love it. It's wonderful. Got off the plane. My drollness does not imply that I'm being sarcastic. I mean it. It's a great place. First time that I went there, I got picked up at the airport by 3 nice white liberals. They're a dime a dozen in Minnesota. They're pretty much everywhere. And nice folks, you know. They drove me to the campus. We were heading to the school. Can't remember which school it was. And they said to me, "Tim, we're very glad you're here for our diversity day. But we do think you should know we don't have any racism at our school." I thought this was fascinating for a few reasons. I mean, first of all, I'm an anti-racism activist, so why in the hell would you bring somebody like that into a place where there is no racism against which one needs to be active? It seemed like a waste of their money and a waste of my time, and although I had every intention of liberating them of their money and giving of my time, I did find it to be a bit redundant, you know. But that wasn't the biggest problem. The biggest problem was that whenever white people tell me there's no racism somewhere, I just sort of instinctively, the hairs on the back of my neck go up, because I'm always fascinated and curious as to how they know that. So I asked them, because I was fascinated, how do you know you have no racism here? And they said, well, you know, Tim, it's this thing we have. Okay. Tell me a little more about that thing, because I'm completely clueless as to what you're talking about. And they said, well, it's this thing we have here. It's sort of like our cultural thing. It's our motto. It's our slogan. It's our way of living up here. And I said, okay, well, just stop teasing me and tell me what this thing is, because we don't have this thing in New Orleans, which is where I was living at the time, and we don't have it in Nashville, which is where I was born and raised and where I'm living again, and they didn't have it in Kansas last week when I was there. So whatever this thing is, please let me know what it is and where I can get it so I can take it back with me, because there are a lot of other places that don't seem to have this thing and where racism still does exist, other than Minnesota. And they didn't sense the sarcasm in my voice. I actually said it just like that. And they said, well, it's this thing we like to call Minnesota nice. And I just sort of froze in the back seat, and I said, okay, because there's got to be more, you know. And I said, and what else? No, that's it. That's it? Minnesota nice. The hell is that? I said, well, it's sort of like the golden rule, you know, do unto others the way you want them to do unto you. And I said, that's it. That's all you do. You just stand up on a soapbox somewhere in St. Paul and turn on a microphone and you scream to the heavens, Minnesota nice, and racism just goes away. Once again, they didn't sense the sarcasm in my voice, and they said, yeah, that's pretty much it. I said, okay, to myself. I said, I think I need to ask some people of color about this. I have a strange sinking feeling they might perceive it a little differently. So over the course of the next several months, I had a chance to interact with folks of color in the state of Minnesota, some black folk, Latino folk, Southeast Asian folk, particularly in the Hmong community around the Twin Cities, and indigenous folks to this continent. And I asked them about Minnesota nice, and every single time I did it, it was as if they had rehearsed the response, but they didn't even know each other. The eyes rolled in the head so loudly that you could hear them gyrate in the sockets and sort of settle back in an icy stare. And they all said, as if they had once again rehearsed, Minnesota nice. Oh my God, that is killing us. And this struck me as odd, because nice is normally the opposite of that which will kill you. So I wanted to have a little bit more clarification. I asked them, and they said, well, there's two problems with Minnesota nice. One is that nice is in the eye of the beholder, right? It's really about the outward manifestation of civility. So you may think you're being nice. I may have another word for that. I may call it passive-aggressive, see? I might know what you say about me behind my back. Oh, you may be nice. You may ask me about my kids and about the weather, and we might even go to lunch. But I know what you say when I'm not around, because I've caught you doing it before. So nice can mask a lot of other stuff that is not nearly so nice, and so we're not all that hip on nice as the outward manifestation of civility. We would prefer honesty. And then the second thing they said, even more important, was you don't understand when everyone is so caught up in niceness as style, as communication style, as civil conversation for what that is worth, then for those of us who are being marginalized, they said, if we are facing discrimination, oppression, marginalization in any form, and we decide to say something about it and raise our voice about it, then we get tagged as what? Not nice. Now, we are the problem, because we have injected race in an atmosphere where it did not exist before, and we have raised an issue that didn't exist until we brought it up. And now we're complaining, and we're causing trouble, and we're causing friction, and we're causing tension. So now we're the ones who are not nice. And this instinctively made sense to me, because at the time I was living in New Orleans, I was contemplating moving back to Nashville after having been there for 10 years. And one of the reasons I almost didn't do it, I did ultimately, but one of the reasons I almost didn't move back to Nashville was because the very month that I had been in Minnesota, I had seen a story on Dateline or 2020 about how Nashville had just been voted the nicest big city in America. And I didn't want to go to the nicest big city in America. Most people can't understand that. Why wouldn't you want to go to the nicest bit? Because I'm an anti-racism activist, and when you're an anti-racism activist and folks are so obsessed with being nice, and see, I grew up in Nashville, so I know what Nashville nice looks like. And I know what it sounds like. And I know that if I start talking about racism, they're going to say, now, couldn't you just say that a little bit nicer? That just seems so rude, what you just said. Couldn't you just take it down a notch? Because that's just starting to get on my nerves, son. No, give me New Orleans any day. Whatever you say about New Orleans, nobody's going to say it's nice. Give me that any day. And so that, more than anything, demonstrated to me this first problem with our normal diversity dialogue. What these white folks were saying is, we want more diversity. We're glad you're here for our diversity day. But really what they were saying is, whatever diversity we want, it better fit into Minnesota nice. And what these folks of color were saying is, it's not us that's the problem, it's the norm that's the problem. We're not happy here because we're being forced to fit into this dominant norm. So yeah, they might want us on their campus, but only if we talk like them, act like them, interact like them, use the same communication style as them, talk about issues the same way they do, view it the same way they do, and we don't want any part of it. And so the norm was the problem that needed to be interrogated, that was marginalizing people, irrespective of niceness. That's the first problem with the traditional discussion. The second problem, again, these are in no particular order, is that too often times, and colleges are worse about this than other institutions, though there are other institutions that do their own horrible variations on the same theme. There's a tendency for colleges and universities, when they begin to bite this issue off and start to talk about it, to end up, whether it's intentional or not, reducing those diversity efforts to what Joy Leary, who's a good friend and a fabulous anti-racism educator in Portland, talks about and calls food, fabric, and festival. That is to say, we're going to learn what these people eat and what kind of interesting textiles they use in the manufacture of their special clothing, and we're going to learn how they celebrate their special holidays. And then we're going to think we did something. So we're going to learn about Kwanzaa. Now we know black people. And we're going to have Thai food next Wednesday. And now we understand all of Southeast Asia. And we're going to have Chinese New Year celebration just that one day now, just one day. Right? We're going to put dream catchers in our rearview mirror and go around telling everybody that we're Indian. And our grandmother, great-great-great-grandmother, was a Cherokee princess. No, she was not. But we get into that cultural trapping, cultural tourism, dropping in on other folks' stuff, observing it, objectifying it, maybe celebrating it for what that's worth. But the problem with that, even if that's a decent place to start, and it is for like 5th graders, that's a good place for, my kids are like 5 and 3. That's cool for them. Food, fabric, and festival works for a 5-year-old. We're talking about full-grown adults. We need to move a little bit past that. A little bit past the celebration of difference. Isn't it neat? You like this food, I like this food. This is a sari, this is a sarape. Stop, 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 because there are some differences that we don't need to celebrate. There are some differences we ought to, in fact, eradicate, and they're the ones we never talk about, or usually don't talk about in this work, and those are the differences in power, and the differences in opportunity, and the differences in access. That's a difference we ought not celebrate. It's a difference we ought to do our best to end. But there is no power analysis in traditional diversity talk. It's just, here's this culture, here's this culture, here's this culture. We're all different. Isn't that neat? Yes, it is. But what's also interesting, not nearly so neat, is that some of those cultures are presumed to be superior, and they continue to dominate the landscape over others that are inferiorized, that are looked at only as add-ons, as additions, or as Joy Leary says, parsley on the plate. It's like when you go to a good restaurant. You know, they give you that little sprig of parsley, and you do know that's not for eating. That's not the meal. That's not why you came, right? That's there for one of two reasons. Either it's for pretty, or it's to clean your breath. Either way, it's a cover-up of the main dish. It's not the point. And so diversity efforts end up, when they're about food, fabric, and festival, they end up being about those distractions and those diversions from a larger analysis of some of these power differences that we need to be examining, and which I'll explore here in a minute. The third problem with the traditional dialogue on diversity is that we tend to get so focused on improving the numbers. And don't get me wrong, the numbers need to improve. That's the best benchmark you have for determining whether or not change is actually happening in an institution. However, it is possible to get so focused on the numbers that you lose sight of the underlying issue of the culture in the environment, which is going to be marginalizing people potentially, whether it's 5 folk, 50 folk, 500 folk, or 5,000 folk. You can have lots of people of color around and still be treating them like crap. You can have lots of folks of color around and still be marginalizing them in a system of inequality. Diversity does not ensure that we're going to have equity. Numbers alone are not enough. And just as a good example of that, just one of many that we could all, I'm sure, talk about. I went to Dubuque, Iowa a couple years ago, and if you're from there, once again, don't take it personal. Another very lovely place. I went there for MLK, and I knew a little bit about Dubuque before I got there. One of the things I knew about Dubuque is that in the early to mid-'90s, they'd had some racial incidents, and in response to these racial incidents, and I mean like overt Klan-type incidents, big-time stuff. In response to these events, they came up with a plan. They wanted to put their best foot forward. They wanted to demonstrate their commitment to diversity. God bless them, because they ain't real diverse right now. And they said, we've got an idea. We need to have more people of color here. Specifically, we need more black people. These were nice white city leaders basically coming up with this brilliant plan. We need more black people. Then they looked at each other and basically said, well, where are we going to find black people? Because they're not a whole lot around here. You know, there was a long-standing small African-American community in Dubuque, but quite small. So they said, well, I've got an idea. We'll take out advertisements for black people. I'm not making this up. I wish I were. And they said, well, that's fine, but where should we take out these advertisements? Because it's not like they're reading the Dubuque paper or the Ottumwa paper or even the Des Moines paper necessarily, because the black community there isn't that big either. So they said, oh, well, we can take care of that. We can take out ads in the Chicago black papers and the Milwaukee papers because those are upriver, and we can tell them that we really want them to come. Well, it won't surprise you to learn that not a whole lot of black folk left their towns and went to Dubuque. But some did, more than you might have expected. A dozen and a half families, whatever, actually took them up on the offer, came, went to Dubuque. What the hell, you know, they roll out the red carpet for us. They must want us. They want diversity. They're all about diversity. They love them some black people. Let's go. Well, the problem was they got down there and they exponentially increased the percentage and number of black folks in a very short period of time. But the problem was that there are some things they hadn't thought to take care of first. So they didn't sit down with the police department and train them to ensure that there'd be equitable policing and no racial profiling. They just took it for granted. The cops will all be nice, but they're all from Minnesota, man. They're not going to mess with anybody. They didn't talk to the teachers in K-12, most of whom had never taught any black children, or maybe only one or two, certainly had never been trained in either multicultural educational methods, let alone anti-racist pedagogy and classroom management techniques. So they just assume the teachers are good people, they're caring, that's why they got into being teachers. They're not going to do anything wrong. Took that for granted. Can't do that. They didn't talk to landlords or bankers to ensure there'd be truly equitable housing opportunity and found out indeed there wasn't. They didn't talk to merchants. They didn't talk to employers to find out if there were any jobs that would be available on a truly equitable basis. So folk got there and they felt set up. And understandably so. The city was more diverse, good for them. They wanted diversity, but they didn't take care of business, so they didn't get equity. And then what happened? Then that group that came became seen as a problem, right? Because, oh, they had high unemployment rates. Surprise, surprise, surprise. They lived in housing that was falling down because the landlords were, oh, surprise, surprise, surprise. Right? After a little bit of time, some of the folk got in trouble. Surprise, surprise, surprise. And pretty soon, the white folks in Dubuque were like, oh, this is a bad idea, see? And the black folk were like, yeah, this was a bad idea, but not for the reason you think it was a bad idea, right? So you could get diversity, and that's fine, but they didn't take care of some of the plus, it's not just that. It's also that sometimes this focus on getting the numbers right, man, it becomes about image and symbol more than substance. It's about putting an image out that says, this is who we are. Isn't that great? So I can get on the web and look at any college's website in this country. Any college in this country that's historically white, an HWCU. We don't use that acronym. We should. I can get on the HWCU websites, and I will find more people of color on that homepage as a percentage of the whole thusly represented than I will ever find at the actual school. And I could find them on the webpage and get on the campus and go looking for them. Can't even find the people that are on the webpage. I think they pulled them off the street half the time. Or it's like one photo that just keeps circulating around. It's always the same shot from a different angle. It's always a white female, a black male with a cardigan sweater tied around his neck real tight. an Asian male, sometimes an Asian female, just to mix it up, and a Latino or Latina of indeterminate nationality, all sitting around drinking Starbucks, acting like somebody just told them the funniest damn joke they ever heard. Sometimes schools take that imagery and symbolism to the extreme. The University of Wisconsin at Madison is a great example of this. Here's a school that prides itself on how radical it is, how progressive it is. People of color there don't feel that way. They're shocked that everybody thinks it's so hip. A lot of white folks who go to UW, it's the most diverse place I've ever been, Madison, Wisconsin. Black and brown folk are like, holy crap. And then UW, just to put out that image, like a couple years ago, they got busted for this. This was in the news. You probably heard about it. They wanted to give the impression of their real commitment to diversity, which may or may not be true. I don't know what's in the hearts of the administrators there, even though I've been there 5 times. It's hard to get a beat on folks. But tell you what, I know what they did. They had this great picture somebody had taken, right, from university relations or whatever, and it was of the football stadium during a football game. I think it was homecoming. It's a great shot because the whole is all this red and white. You know, those are the colors, red, white, and silver, I guess, red, white, and gray. So I got this great shot, this sea of red and white and gray in the stands, but problem was, everybody in the shot that they could tell was white. Just this sea of white faces. And they looked at it and they said, nah, this isn't going to go so well because this doesn't give the right impression of who we are and what we're trying to be. Some intrepid soul in university relations or somewhere said, oh, we can fix this. I think I have a picture of a black guy in Photoshop that I can put in. It was even a student there at the time. He was getting ready to leave, actually, but he was still a student, and they took his head. I don't know why they had this guy's head in Photoshop. That makes you nervous, keeping a file on this guy with his photo. But anyway, they got his photo. They inserted it in the picture. The only reason they got busted is probably because they put his face like in between the guy and his girlfriend, you know. And they said, no, I'm pretty sure he wasn't there. So they caught him, and they had to apologize. Oh, sorry. You know, they had good intentions. They were trying to give an impression of really wanting diversity, but they really were more concerned about the image than the truth. So that's the third problem with the dialogue. It ends up being about getting the numbers right, either for image or for whatever other purpose, but not really necessarily dealing with the underlying cultural issues. And the final, and I think if I had to rank them, this would be the most important, so it's actually why I leave it for last. The biggest problem with the existing diversity dialogue is that we never ask the prior question. And what I mean by that is, if you want to know how you're going to increase diversity in an institution, if that's what you're about, if that's really what you want to do, what would be the first thing that you would do? The first question that you would ask? The first question you would ask is, how in the hell did we get this undiverse in the first place? Right? Because if you don't know the answer to that, how are you going to rectify that? You can't reverse that which you haven't even identified as a root cause of a problem. But we act like diversity or the lack thereof just happens by coincidence. So if a community doesn't have any folks of color, oh well, I don't know how that happened. 93% of corporate executives are white men? Mystery to me, man. I don't know what happened. 91% of government contracts go to companies owned by white men? You're kidding. It makes no sense. 85% of tenured faculty white men? Could have knocked me over with a feather. That's stunning. I have no idea how it happened. It must be osmosis. It must be sunspots. It must be the position of the moon in the sky. Tidal waves causing those outcomes. My town doesn't have, I'm from Illinois, and my town doesn't have any black people in it. That's a coincidence. Not so much. If you know the history of this state in particular, you'll know that Illinois has the distinction of being the state that had the most towns in it where people of color were not allowed to be after the sun went down, and so they got run out. Oh, they used to be in those towns, many of them. And then in the early part of the 1900s, there were purges of those communities where mass violence was unleashed against black folks, and they were run out. There were more in Illinois, dozens and dozens and dozens, and you can read about them one after the other in Jim Loewen's new book, Sundown Towns, where he identifies them and talks about the history and speaks with the locals. And it's a history that very few young people in those little Illinois towns know anything about. They just think, oh, it's just a coincidence nobody's here. Racism, man, I know y'all got that in the South, man. That's bad, isn't it? See, but in the South, we didn't run people of color out because we had other ideas of what we were going to do to people of color, which were also messed up. But we wanted them around to do the work, you know. But in Illinois and Indiana, they just said, get the hell out. In Oregon, they just said, get the hell out. And all these places in the Midwest and heading out west, they just said, get the hell out. So this is not a coincidence when a community is not diverse, man. It is definitely the result of quite deliberate policies, practices, and procedures, which means if we want to reverse that, we have to first own that history and be honest about what has and has not happened, and understand that we have to make very deliberate efforts to undo that. You can't just sit back and say, well, we'll admit folks, if they're willing to work for it and they want to come in and they want to apply and they've got the credentials, we'll admit them and we'll hire them if they want to work here, and we'd love to have people of color in our community, whether it's Dubuque or any other town, because folks are not just going to want to waltz into a place if they have a reason to know or to think based on history that they are not welcome. So we have to make deliberate efforts at inclusion, just like folks made deliberate efforts at exclusion. If the one thing didn't happen on accident, the thing we're trying to do isn't going to happen by accident either. And so we have to be every bit as deliberate as those who gave us this messed up legacy. And that messed up legacy, whether we ever want to name it or not, and we rarely do, is a legacy of racism, past, present, and the combination of those two things. Contrary to what I learned in high school science classes, inertia is not merely a property of the physical universe. It is also a property of the political, social, and economic universe, to the extent that that which happens in one generation continues to reap legacy in the next generation until it is met with a force of equal or greater power to reverse that legacy. Doesn't stop on its own. It is not a video game where we can hit a reset button and start over because we do not like the outcome the first time. If you were to think of American history, for example, as an intergenerational poker match. I did not come up with this analogy, by the way, but I want to acknowledge that it's not mine. I don't remember who I stole it from, but I do want you to know it's stolen. And if I ever remember who I stole it from, I'll give them credit, but I just don't remember. But I don't want to take credit for it, so it's out there. If you think of American history, and for that matter, if you were to think of any state in what we now call the United States, their history as an intergenerational poker match, you would see what I'm talking about. If you go back 15 generations or whatever, I don't know what it was since the colonies, how many generations, I'm not good at math like that, but let's just say it's 15 for the hell of it. Go back 15 generations to the first of the colonies in what became the United States, and if you think of American history in this term of an intergenerational poker match, I think we'd all agree, and I think anyone out there in the big wide world would also agree, that that first white player at the table was pretty clearly cheating all the other players. Like, there's no controversy there. I mean, that's, nobody, I don't think that's true. No, we all know that's true. So the first white player cheating everybody, making up rules, changing the rules in the middle, and if anybody tried to get a fair shake, shooting them, whatever. It didn't go real well. So just cheating, just cheating all the time. And then all those players die. The white player and the players, they all die, and pass the game down to their kids, and white guy does the same thing, cheats all the time, gets all these chips, keeps accumulating all these chips by having cheated. Right? They die, pass the game down to their kids, and it goes on and on and on and on and on. And in every generation, the white player is cheating everybody else. We get to the 14th generation, and the great to the nth degree grandson of the first cheating white guy says, now, what my great to the nth degree granddaddy did to yours was just wrong. And it's wrong what my daddy did to yours as well. So I'm here to announce that from this day forward, there will be no more cheating. From this day forward, we will play by one set of rules. Isn't that great? Would we be at all surprised when the folks of color gathered around the table responded to that by saying, well, I guess it's better than if you were to keep cheating us, but while we're having this honest discussion, can we perhaps have a little talk about all those chips on your side of the table? And then the white player, of course, would say, what? No, we can't, because I didn't take those. That was my great granddaddy. He was a jerk for doing it, but now I'm innocent. I had nothing to do with it. As in, I didn't own any slaves. I didn't take half of Mexico. I didn't kill any Indians. I didn't lock up Japanese Americans. That wasn't me. That was somebody else. I'm not responsible, and I'm keeping the stuff. Because I earned it. And I'm giving you a fair shake now. See? This is what we do. We forget that there's this history that we have to be accountable to, and to some extent accountable for. So let's talk then about racism, past, present, and the combination of those things, particularly as it relates to higher education. Before we can do that, we have to clarify terms, because if I were to do a regular workshop and ask 50 people in a workshop bigger than I like, because like I said, I like 35, but whatever, a 50-person workshop, if I were to ask people to define racism, now, in a university setting, sometimes it's different because folks are real hip and they've been to these things before, so they all probably on the same page more so than the general public. But if I just do a workshop with the general sort of cross-section of people, you ask 50 people to give you a definition of racism, and you'll get maybe not 50 different ones, but you definitely get 15, 20, 25 different ones, right? And there may be some overlap, but there's also some fairly distinct differences. And whenever you have that much disagreement on a term, you know you have a real hard time getting your head around what it means then to address it, because it's hard to address a concept when you've got all these people who conceptualize it quite differently, because we're not talking about the same thing. I could be talking about one thing, you're talking about a totally different thing, and by the time we've spent 3 hours on it in a workshop, you haven't really made any progress because we're not on the same page. So I want to be clear about how I'm using the term. It's not that you have to use it this way, though I think it's the best way to use the term and to conceptualize the term, but I at least want you to know where I'm coming from. People tend to assume that racism is synonymous with prejudice and bigotry, and as a result, they can't really imagine higher education being a racist place because they don't see, at least not on a regular basis, that kind of overt bigotry and prejudice that we associate with the term. Now, it happens from time to time. Last month, we had an example of this at the University of Texas School of Law, one of the finest law schools in the country, where a group of white students who have all graduated from very good undergraduate institutions and have gone through now 22, 23 years of their life and intend to be members of the Texas or some other state bar when they finish, that is to say, responsible to the system of justice in this country, decided that it would be funny, they being white, to have what they called a ghetto party and dress up in afro wigs, blackface, in some instances, and gold chains, drinking malt liquor, and mocking those that they believe live in the ghetto in the style that they associate with the so-called ghetto. So that happens from time to time. In fact, it happens every year somewhere. Some campus, every year, sometimes 2 or 3, has one of these blackface incidents or ghetto parties, and every single time the students are shocked that it was offensive. I don't understand why you think it's racist. It was just a party. I don't understand. I don't get it. Of course you don't, because no one ever told any of these folks, no one ever told most of us in school what blackface was about. No one ever really talked to us about the objectification of cultures of color. And so when that happens, that's obviously an example of racism. But if all we do is realize that is an example of racism, then we miss the true nature of what racism is and how it operates. It does not operate at the margins or as an aberration within higher education or any other institution. It operates at the center of the enterprise itself. The definition of racism that I'm working with, though it certainly would include things like overtly racist incidents, it would also be a much more expansive definition, and it's one that really isn't rooted in ideology or philosophy, because one of the easiest ways that we can, sort of reduce the rancor over this discussion is by taking it out of the ideological realm and just putting it in the grammatical realm, where the ability to disagree requires one to take it up with Webster's and not Tim Wise. So the definition I use is just rooted in grammar. It's got nothing to do with ideology, philosophy, or politics. It's simply because I look at the word, I see that it ends with 3 little letters. Those letters are ISM, and I know what isms are. I know because I've learned about other isms in school where I was taught about them. When I see something that is an ism, I know instinctively that it is usually going to be 2 things. One is an ideology or a worldview, absolutely. But it's not only that, it's also by definition systemic. It is also a set of institutions. How do I know that? Simple, because I know other examples of which we all are aware. Capitalism, socialism, communism, fascism, authoritarianism, totalitarianism, etc. Isms are almost always going to be both ideology and system. So if we start with that assumption, we then have to ask ourselves, well, what does it mean for racism to operate systemically? And I would suggest that really, at the systemic level, the easiest definition of racism is a system of inequality predicated on race, so-called. And we understand biologically and genetically the thing called race is quite fictional, but in social terms, of course, it's quite real. So inequality predicated on race, and it is a system that is maintained by policies, practices, procedures, and presumptions which have the effect, whether they are intended or not. The intent is not the point. The effect is the point of perpetuating those inequalities that are predicated upon race. And of course, we shouldn't be looking only at intent, because the reality is injury because it injures, not because I intended to hurt you. On a legal sense, we may have one standard, but in the conversational sense that we're trying to take action, we don't need to be waiting for intent. If I were to step on your foot in the lunch line in the cafeteria and do it so hard that I were to break your toe, you're probably not going to give a damn whether I woke up this morning in my hotel in Columbus, Indiana, which is where I was last night, and got on the road saying, oh, I'm going to break some toes at Eastern Illinois University. That's why I'm going. That's my goal. You're not going to care. If I step on your toe and break it, you're going to want compensation, and you will be owed that compensation. So I will either pay your doctor bill, I'll at least buy you an aspirin, something to deal with your busted up toe. And not because I intended to do it, but because I have caused injury. It's interesting. In the whole world of tort law, that is to say personal injury law, that kind, in torts, the only tort that you have to prove intent for in order to have a good case in this country are discrimination claims. It's really interesting. Any other tort, all you have to show is sort of, neglect, that you should have known that something was going to happen, that it was a foreseeable consequence of your actions. Now, obviously, if you can prove intent, you get bigger damages. You definitely can get a bigger, payment or settlement. But you don't have to prove intent in order to have a case. But in discrimination law, that's the one where the courts have said, you can't prove intent, no case. I wonder why they've made it so much harder to prove discrimination. I'll leave it up to your imagination as to why. So racism then is maintained by these things, whether intentional or not, which have the effect of perpetuating inequality, which means that it's not just the UT Ghetto Party that was racist, it's also the response of the administration to that party, which is racist. And that response was to do almost nothing. The administration not only has no punishment against these folks who created a hostile environment. Understand, this is a hostile environment. If you were to do this in a place of employment, you would be sued. Because you don't have to do it repeatedly to have a hostile environment. The law says either repeated or serious enough infractions, even if they only happen one time, are enough to create a hostile environment in the workplace. Why we don't apply the same standard to places of higher education, I have no idea. This isn't just like someone who got up and said, I read the bell curve and I think it's true. That's a philosophical, intellectual argument which we can have. These are people who are doing an overtly racist thing, and whether or not they have free speech in the sense that they can't be jailed, the idea that they cannot be punished even though they've created a hostile environment for students of color, is nonsensical. And that idea that there should be no consequence, but there was none. And so when the administration says, A, there will be no punishment, and B, they announce, we don't think the students did it on purpose, which was a way of minimizing. We don't think they understood the implications. Well, if you admitted a whole bunch of white folks to one of the best law schools in the United States who don't understand why a ghetto party is offensive, maybe you ought to kick them out and start over again and stop obsessing over the LSAT, because these are all bright kids, but they don't know their ass from their elbow about social reality. They come in, and these are going to be future lawyers, future judges. Good Lord. You really need to get off of that U.S. News and World Report train that said you were like one of the best law schools in the country. This is your raw material. You really need to start over again. But they announced that it wasn't intentionally racist, and that kind of practice on the part of the administration fits the definition of racism that I've used, because it's a practice which has the effect, whether intentional or not, of perpetuating inequality between the people at that law school. What message does it send to students of color? The message that it sends is that your interests and your concerns are secondary to the concerns of these people who we will cater to and pander to and not punish even when they create a hostile environment for you. How much clearer could it be that such a thing would create inequality of opportunity and outcomes? Of course it does, but nobody wants to call that racism, though it certainly fits any logical, rational definition of it. So what does all of this mean beyond examples like that in higher ed? Well, I'll talk about a few examples in a second and then ways to respond to them. But before we do that, we have to understand something else about the system of higher education in which we find ourselves. We have to let go of this mythology that higher ed, when it perpetuates inequality, is somehow failing in its mission. That's what a lot of people think. A lot of people who are educators view education, whether it's K-12 or whether it's higher ed, as the great equalizer. They'll even use that phraseology, right? The idea is we want everybody to get as much education as possible because that will be the great equalizer. That's why a lot of people go into teaching. It's why we stress education to our kids, this idea that that's going to be the way to have opportunity in this country. But we need to be very clear about the system we're taking part in, and that we are all at some level part of. The purpose of education, be it primary, secondary, or higher education, has never been to equalize opportunity. In fact, it has been to do exactly the opposite. If we start out with the idea that education is about equalizing stuff, we're going to be very frustrated. We're going to be banging our heads against a wall, wondering why it's not happening. Gee, I wonder why it doesn't happen. Why is it that the educational performance gaps, for example, between white students and students of color have dropped in the last 25 years. The dropout rates have come closer together. The test scores on the NAEP and other tests have come closer together, and yet the income and wealth gaps have continued to grow. Black and Latino males with college degrees, higher unemployment rates than white men who only finished high school, so something's going wrong. Folks are staying in school longer, and they're still falling farther and farther behind in relative terms. Maybe it is because the system was never intended to create equity. We know it wasn't if we just pay attention to all those people who've talked about the system of education throughout the years, some of whom we revere as great educational thinkers. Thomas Jefferson, founder of the University of Virginia, among other things that he did. You've probably heard of him before. He is revered for a lot of reasons that I find fascinating, but among the reasons that we sometimes don't talk about but should. He's looked at as this very foresightful, very, very insightful and forward-thinking educator, belief in universal education. Actually, Thomas Jefferson, like all the folks of it, they didn't believe in universal education. They didn't want to educate folks of color, and they didn't want to educate most women. So it wasn't universal. But they didn't even really want to educate most white men. Thomas Jefferson actually is famous for saying that we should have 3 years of compulsory schooling. I guess that, 3 years was good enough in 1790. I don't know. But 3 years of compulsory schooling so that we could, in his words, rake a few geniuses from the rubbish. The underlying assumption of that comment being that most people are pretty much garbage. And if we just give them 3 years, we'll be able to figure out who the trash is and who the pearls in the oysters are, so to speak, and we'll rake a few geniuses from this trash pile, and then we'll just throw the trash pile back where it is. In other words, education wasn't an equalizer. Education was about creating and perpetuating profound inequality. That was its goal. And then come a little bit more than a century forward, Woodrow Wilson, who also would become president of the United States. Before that, he was president of Princeton, and he too was revered as this very insightful and forward-thinking educator and thinker about education. He too didn't view education as an equalizer. He said that what this society needs is one class of persons to prepare itself for the receipt of a liberal education, that being the term that at that time was used for higher ed, and another group of people, a much larger group by necessity in this or any other society, Wilson said, to forego the privilege of a liberal education and suit themselves to the performance of certain difficult manual tasks. In other words, education was intended to provide opportunities to the special people, the beautiful people, and to hell with the rest of you. You're going to work for us. And you're going to do the hard work that we are too good to do. That is the purpose of college. Understand, the reason I'm telling you this is if you think the system is intended to create equity and then it creates inequity, you view that as a system failure. And we think, we got to tinker with this somehow and make it work right. But understand, if the system was not set up for certain folk in the beginning and it then proceeds not to serve their interest, that is not system failure. That is system success. And if you don't like the outcome, you have to change the system. You can't just tinker around it because the system it's like Katrina, man. All these folks after Katrina running around saying the system failed the people of New Orleans. What the hell, you think the system worked for the people of New Orleans on August 27th? She's the only one that doesn't think it did? What, y'all actually think that like prior to Katrina, she gets it, and y'all are like, I don't know, maybe it was. What, wait. Prior to Katrina, you think that system was working for people of color? Of course not. It wasn't intended to. Man, only people that weren't shocked by Katrina were the folks that were in it. All the rest of us are like, oh my God, how can this happen in America? Where have we been? How can all these people be displaced from their homes? What? I mean, let's just be honest real quick history lesson. Black folks wouldn't be here but for an act of displacement. Indigenous folks been displaced from hundreds of years on forward to now. Latinos displaced, over half of their territory taken in a war that we start. Asian Americans displaced to help build the railroads in this country and make our economy strong. Displacement of people of color is the norm. The only thing different is Wolf Blitzer was on the scene with a camera. And Anderson Cooper was there, and Geraldo was there. Shepard Smith was there. Had it on TV in the 50s and 60s when they knocked down hundreds of black-owned businesses and hundreds of black-owned homes in New Orleans to make way for the interstate to come through the Treme, the oldest free black community in the United States. There were no television cameras on it. They displaced hundreds of, thousands actually, of black folks in the community where now the Superdome stands. Used to be a place where people lived, knocked down their stuff, jacked their property, built a Superdome so the Saints could have a place to play and lose. Used to be. Now they win, so now they think it was a good deal. Place for Tulane to play, and they did lose for sure. Place for the Rolling Stones to come have a concert. So people have been getting displaced since day one. There was nothing new about it. The system was intended not to serve them. It didn't serve them. That is success. If you don't like it, you change the system. You don't act as if, gosh, we just can't get it right. We just can't quite figure out why it's not working. We're smart people. How can we keep screwing it up? I don't know. It's crazy. Osmosis, again, sunspots, lunar tides, or maybe it's the intent. Come forward into the 1990s, and William Bennett, former Secretary of Education and former drug czar, two great jobs that go great together, says on national TV that the biggest problem with American education is, quote, too many people are going to college, end of quote. Now that's a fascinating comment. Because like a minute and a half before he made it, I was watching that show and there was a commercial. You know those commercials, the ones that tell you to stay in school, get as much education as you have a celebrity on there and that star shoots across the screen, the more you know. The whole idea, stay in school, learn as much as you can, learn as much as you can, learn as much as you can. And then Bill Bennett's like, no, not really. You don't need to do that. Too many people going to school. Now, who's he talking about? Who's he talking about? That's too many people going. Is he talking about the mediocre children that go to prep schools, get C's, get into college because of who their daddy is, get C's, and then 20 years later get to go back and speak to the graduating class because they're president of the United States and brag about getting C's? Is that who it is that ought not be going to college? The children of the rich and mediocre? Is that who he's talking about? Who are taking slots from hardworking people? No, of course not. We know they're going to college. We know they're going. We expect them. Nobody ever asked whether or not the children of the elite in this country might want to operate a cash machine in a grocery store. We never asked. We just know they're better than that. Or whether they might want to pick up trash twice a week in my neighborhood. We just know they're, quote unquote, better than that. So when Bill Bennett says too many people going to college, we know who he means. He means the folks who normally we wouldn't expect to be there. He's talking about working class people of all races. He's talking about people of color, especially if they're lower moderate income. It's a mentality of the slave owner, whether he said it directly or not. It's a mentality that says if we teach all these folks to read, who is going to pick that cotton? See, if everybody gets a college education, who is going to pick up my garbage on Wednesday? I rely on people not having enough education to where then they can be made to do that work because, of course, I'm too good for it. Because we have a society that says some of us are above that work. But keep in mind, that's the most important work that gets done in my community. If those men don't show up on Wednesday, I am screwed. I don't even know where the landfill is, nor the recycle facility. We will have epidemics. We will have rats running around on my block if they don't show up. But if the stockbroker who lives 3 doors down doesn't show up for like a month, nobody's going to miss him, right? Stock will still get traded. The world will go on. But the people who actually do the work and are the least rewarded for it, oftentimes at the bottom of the educational scale. And Bill Bennett says we don't want them to go to college because we got to maintain that system. It's the purpose of the system. In other words, we got to start doing more than just tinkering with it. One of the problems we have in higher education is that a lot of this stuff is so subtle. It's not subtle to the folks who are targeted by it. It's not subtle to the folks who are affected by it, but it's subtle to the rest of us. So let's talk about a society in which we profoundly unstandardize the educations that our children receive. Profoundly unstandardized educations in terms of resources, curriculum, quality of teacher instruction, classroom climate, all of those things. And we brag about it. We brag about the inequality in our school. And when I say brag, I mean that we're happy that we have all this decentralized school system. We like the fact we've got hundreds or even thousands of different school districts all doing their same thing. Why? Because we're glad that it's not big government. Big government doesn't run the schools here. It's all local control. Yeah, unlike every one of the countries that we compete against and regularly kick our ass in international educational competitions. You're right. We don't do big government like all of them do. They all fund their education principally through central government. That also sets a lot of the standards and curriculum. But by God, we're decentralized. And we're proud of it, even though clearly isn't paying off very well. And then we take all these unstandardized children and give them standardized exams. Give them the same test, even though we know they didn't get the same material because we made sure they didn't. We made sure they didn't because some people got to get the really hard stuff and have the honors and AP classes, and other people don't get that. And then we give them all the same test, and when they don't do as well as somebody else, we say, well, sorry, you're just not good enough to go here. Maybe you shouldn't go to college at all. Too many people going to college. That's what Bill Bennett says. He wrote the Book of Virtues. He should know. So, maybe you can do like Bill Bennett, go win money at the slot machines. Been on the road for a long time, y'all. He's good. So then we have admissions policies that look at these prior outcomes, and we do the same thing with hiring. We hire faculty and staff and all of these different positions based on what we consider to be merit standards without considering how merit indicators themselves reflect racial inequality of opportunity and how subjective those standards are and our evaluative mechanisms are and our evaluative abilities are, even when the standard itself is fair. So, for example, think about the most obvious thing I can say probably today is that if I've had more opportunity than somebody else in the labor market to accumulate credentials, I'm supposed to have a better resume. That's the point. If I've had more opportunity and I didn't get a better resume than you, there's probably something wrong with me. If I had more opportunity, and if anyone has had more opportunity than somebody else, they're supposed to look better on paper. But should we reward them just because they had a head start, just because they were able to get in the pipeline? A couple months ago, I was debating Carl Cohen on affirmative action at the University of Michigan State. He's a philosopher at the University of Michigan. Carl Cohen is against affirmative action because he thinks folks ought to just be hired on the basis of merit standards. Carl Cohen has been a tenured faculty member at the University of Michigan since 1957. What fair competition did Carl Cohen win to get his gig in 1957? Who the hell was he competing against? A bunch of other white men. He might have been the best of the white men, but he didn't have to compete against any white women. He didn't have to compete against any men and women of color, but he has the audacity, as do a lot of folks that have been in the pipeline for years, to think that they are deserving and entitled to their stuff. And that if we have any kind of policy that tries to bring other folks in who don't have quite the same credentials as they do because they've had all this opportunity to rack up credentials, that somehow they ought to be excluded. And that's called fairness. What it is racism. And what it is sexism. If I've had a 3-lap head start on you, I am supposed to hit the tape first. If I have a 3-lap head start on you and you close the gap to 2 laps, guess what? If you're getting a racing team together, you don't want me. You want the guy or the woman that closed the gap, even if they still hit the tape lower because and slower and after me. Because they're the ones who ran the hardest. They're the ones who persevered. They're the ones who overcame obstacles. And they're the ones who are likely to be the faster runners. But we have a winner-take-all mentality that says, I'm looking at this resume, and I'm looking at this resume, and this one looks more impressive. This person has more publications. This person has been to more conferences and given speeches. This person has better references. This person went to a better institution previously, without realizing how those standards are themselves reflections of existing inequality. There's also a subjective evaluation process, even when the standards themselves are fair. So even if we started with the assumption that the standards we're using, let's say for evaluating potential hirees, potential employees of a college or university, potential faculty during a faculty search, or potential students during an admission process, even if we assume that the standards are fair, and I'm not, I just finished telling you I think they're not. But even if we assume that they were, there's still the problem of subjective evaluation. The research going back now a quarter of a century, if not longer, all of it confirms that we are quicker to spot merit in somebody who reminds us of ourselves than anyone else. And if most of the people who are doing the evaluation are disproportionately white and male, it means that even if there is no overt bias, they're more likely to spot merit in other white men than they are a Filipina female. And they're going to think that their evaluation's been purely fair. There's no overt bias going on necessarily. It may be very much at the level of the subconscious, but what the research says is that when people are being evaluated in an interview, whether it's a student interview, a job interview, it doesn't matter, the things that confirm negative stereotypes are the things that we remember. So if something happens in that interview, the person of color, let's say, who's being evaluated, or the woman of any color who's being evaluated, does something, says something, that confirms or triggers, not confirms, but triggers a remembrance of a stereotype in the evaluator's mind. That is the thing that will get remembered because it triggers what psychologists call a mental schema, right? A set of ideas that are all linked to one another. So you knock down one and it's like dominoes, and all of a sudden that's what sticks in your mind. Oh, the person of color ended a sentence with a preposition. They mispronounced a word, or that came off as somehow less than brilliant. And that triggers a stereotype that's often held about folks of color in terms of their intelligence or their ability to articulate. If a woman does something in the interview which triggers a remembrance of a stereotype about emotionalism, right, that'll get them in trouble, whereas a man could do the same thing. Like I could be in an interview just waving my hands, all this crazy stuff I'm doing in here, And y'all are laughing. You think it's funny, man. If I was a woman up here doing this, there'd be people like, what is wrong with her? She has lost her mind, you know? Because it doesn't trigger the stereotype of emotionalism. I'm pretty jacked up, you can tell. But it doesn't reflect badly on me. That's just energy. That's just energy. That's just a good attitude. That's charisma. You know? So, but women of any color, people of color, who are either male or female, doesn't matter, are in a situation where if they trigger that stereotype, that's what gets remembered. If the white person does the same thing, or if the male of whatever color does the very same thing in that interview, that won't be remembered because it doesn't trigger a stereotype. So if I screw up and mispronounce a word, end a sentence with a preposition, don't have a really good spot-on answer to a question that they ask me, it doesn't trigger a stereotype about white male intelligence because there is no negative stereotype about white male intelligence that we're aware of. And so it goes in the ear and it goes out the brain and it's not remembered. We know this is true. And I'm going to give you an example which sounds partisan. I assure you it is not meant to be. Because when the last president was president, I made all kinds of fun of him too. And I'm going to make fun of whoever the next one is. Don't care which party. But right now we have the one that we have. So you'll just have to indulge me this little bit of time. We have a president who, even by his own admission, by the admission of people who like him, voted for him twice, and give him money to this day, people who support him, they all know that he's not the most articulate person in the world. And I'm not saying this to be cruel. It is not a cheap shot. It is something which he himself would acknowledge. In fact, a lot of his supporters sort of think it's cute. I run across folks like this all the time who think that his stumbling over the English language is actually endearing. They say things like, well, now that just shows he's normal, folks. I like the fact that he's not slick like the last one, and he mispronounces words that I don't know how to pronounce either, and it makes me feel better, and I think if he was still drinking, I'd love to have a beer with him. And other folks I've heard actually say, well, that's just Texas. Which is a very odd thing to say about a man who spent almost all of his life in Connecticut, but whatever. The only member of the Bush family to speak with a Southern accent. I'll leave it to your imagination as to how that happened. But here's the point, because that was just for fun, that part. The point is, if this president were a black man and mispronounced the English language with the regularity as this white man does, showed himself unable to pronounce words that my 5-year-old has no trouble with, and makes up other words that don't exist in any dictionary on planet Earth, if any black man did that, you know it would trigger the stereotype about black intelligence. Take us back to that In Living Color skit. All right? Some of y'all remember the skit where the guy just made up words, man, just made up stuff. And nobody was like, oh, he should be president. Right? They didn't say Damon Wayans, now he needs to be president for that character. Looked at him like an idiot. And this guy makes up words, and it doesn't trigger a stereotype, so it gets forgotten about. It gets forgotten about. He can screw up the English language, it's no big deal. If he were Latino or Asian American and mispronounced the language that much, folks would say, you need to go back to your country of origin. Then you can come back into our country after you learn English. You know this is true because, oh, and by the way, you do know if he was black and made all those, black folks would be like, every time they watched him on TV, they would just be like, come on. Strategery, damn. Stop. You're screwing it up for all of us. They will never vote for another black man. But those of us who are white, we don't think that like no other white man will ever be president because this one has demonstrated that we as a group are incompetent. Like we know it's not going to reflect on us. And you know all this is true. Anybody who doesn't think it's true, just think about the fact anytime a person of color is articulate and does pronounce the words correctly, it's such a shock to us that we point it out. As in, you're so articulate. Because that's a way of saying, we're shocked. We didn't think you would be. We figured you're a blithering idiot. Right? Tim Duncan, man. You've ever seen Tim Duncan interviewed, right? Ball player. They interview him, and people are shocked that he can speak. He went to Wake Forest, man. It's a good school. They act like they just pass him through. No. David Robinson, same thing. He was in the Naval Academy. What do you expect when people get so shocked? And then I meet like Asian Pacific American young people who are like third, fourth generation in this country. Latinos like third, fourth generation in this country, right? And every time they speak English well, sometimes they always have these stories about folks come to them like, where are you from? You speak English so well. I'm from Kansas City. No, really. Where are you really from? Kansas City. No, but I mean, where are your parents from? St. Louis. Can we stop? So white folk don't trigger these stereotypes, and as a result, a person can evaluate us and really think purely sincerely that they've treated everybody equally. In fact, the sort of sick little thing about this is that you could hook an evaluator up to a lie detector and monitor them. And they would tell you, I hired the most qualified person, and they would pass the test because they would honestly think that they did. That's what the research suggests. It's not that they're sitting there, I can't wait to screw over people of color today. They don't even have to do that. Even if that never, and it does happen, I'm just saying, even if it never happened, right? These perceptual biases would creep in. We would think that we were being fair. We would find out after that we're not. It's one of the reasons, that now concert orchestras, they have tryouts behind a screen, because it used to be that women couldn't get gigs playing in an orchestra because even when they would play just as beautifully, they would just be looked at differently. So they put them behind a screen where you can't even tell who's back there, and then all of a sudden you end up with greater equity and diversity in concert orchestras. So, this is the kind of thing we understand, and studies have proven it for years and years and years, but we still think that we're being fair. What this all suggests is that we've got to make very deliberate efforts to check our own biases. We've got to build in various firewalls along the way so that we make sure that this evaluation is being done by as many people as possible, with as much input as possible, and that the standards we're using for evaluation are regularly vetted to determine two things. First is whether or not they actually have predictive validity of ability. That is to say, is it a valid construct to use to determine merit in the first place, just on its own merits? In other words, is it a legitimate standard? This is called, in the parlance of affirmative action, this is called validation of selection instruments, where you subject your selection instrument to a validation process to determine if it makes any sense. And then the second aspect is whether or not it has a profoundly disparate impact. If it has a disparate impact on the basis of race or gender, then we should be looking at eliminating or altering that standard. A lot of times we have standards we don't know that they're having that effect. Other times we're actually quite clear. I mean, the New York Police Department is an infamous example. They used to have a 6-foot height requirement to be a cop in the NYPD. And it was flat out because they didn't want women in the force. I mean, that was why they did it. They got sued. They lost, thankfully. But had you subjected that standard to a validation criteria, it would have failed. There was no evidence that you needed to be 6 feet tall to be a member of the NYPD, just like there's no evidence that you need to have a certain SAT or ACT score to be a decent college student. In fact, the correlation coefficient between the SAT or the ACT and first-year grades, which is the only, I should point out, the only year that it's even intended to predict. It has no long-term predictive ability with regard to four-year grades, graduation rates, graduation rank, future professional success, none at all. In fact, some studies have actually found there's an inverse relationship between SAT and LSAT scores, both in undergrad and law school, and future professional success. So it actually can be inverse, but the correlation coefficient in most of the studies is about a 0.4. And for those who don't do statistical work, let's just discuss how pathetic this really is. What it suggests is that the difference between you and me in our first year of college can be explained about 16% of the difference between it, because you have to square the coefficient, you have to multiply it by itself. 0.4 by times 0.4, 16% of the difference between us might be predicted at most by that kind of test, leaving 84% completely unexplained. But we keep using it because it works for some people. It works for those who've had more opportunity. Again, the system's working the way it was intended to work. It's not working for some, but it wasn't meant to. So we have to talk about how we might indeed change that system. So these subjective evaluation standards, whether it's for students or whether it's for people trying to get jobs, means that at the end of the day, we have to make very deliberate efforts. We cannot be colorblind, this new mentality and new paradigm that some would have us adopt, where we don't notice things like race. First of all, colorblindness is a lie. It isn't true. We do indeed see it. We see it when color moves into our previously white neighborhood. We do indeed notice. When our daughters bring home folks, a little bit of color in them, we notice. When our sons do the same, we notice. So the idea we don't notice color, we notice it when it joins our family, like every time. I've never met the person yet who came to the wedding of their son or their daughter and said, well, I'll be damned. You're getting married to a person of color. I had no idea. Good Lord. Shocking. I had noticed all of these years. Of course we notice. We always notice. The question is what we make of it. And to be blind to color is not only a lie, it's also undesirable. As Julian Bond has said, being blind to color means that we will be blind to the consequences of color. Color continues to have consequences. We have to take account of what those are, and we have to take account and notice of the thing that is producing that outcome in terms of a discriminatory treatment, if we're going to overcome that. That means quite aggressive forms of affirmative action. That means using evaluation standards which are really based on actual ability, not these subjective standards that we have used up until now. But it means more than that. It's not just about who we hire and who we admit, though it is about that. It's about what we do when folks get here. Because the problem in education as well is that you can have, it's just like Dubuque, you can have diversity, you can get folk in the room, you can colorize the room the way Ted Turner colorizes old movies, and that's great. But the problem then is what happens to folks when they're in that historically white, overwhelmingly white space. Well, we know what happens because, again, the research is quite clear on what happens. The sense of marginalization, of isolation, of ostracism, and the experience of being so marginalized is profound. And it is highly correlated with folks not sticking around very long. You can get folks there. Look, Washington State University in Pullman, several years ago, set up a program where they set aside something like $200,000 to recruit faculty of color. Because they really wanted, just like Dubuque and this school in Minnesota, they wanted diversity, and I think they were really sincere, actually. I talked to some of the administrators. I really believe they had a real honest commitment. They set aside $200,000. I mean, that's putting money where your mouth is, so that sounded real good. And they got people there. They would get a handful of, especially like, they figured they could get 3 or 4 new faculty, to come on, tenure track positions starting at, 50 or 60 grand, which in Pullman, really good money. And they could do that every year. And then whatever money they didn't use, they'd roll it over to the next year, and they'd get 200 grand more the next year. And the whole idea was after 4 or 5 years, they ought to have a pretty good cadre of tenure track faculty folk. But what they found was that after 2 or 3 years, sometimes after 1, certainly before the time for a tenure eval, folks of color would just leave. And they didn't understand what was going on. Because they rolled out the red carpet. They put out the money, man. They didn't just say, please come, here's a job. They were like, here's some bonus money. They were paying for what they valued. They actually had a premium placed on faculty of color because they felt it would be valuable for their institution. So being a person of color even became an indicator of a special merit, if you will, in the eyes of the Wazoo administrators, which is good because it was going to serve a function that having a bunch of more white faculty would not have served, a special benefit. So they were willing to pay for it, but folks left. And when administrators asked me why folks were leaving, I said, well, I don't know. How many of them have kids? And I was told most of the faculty had had children quite young. A lot of them were new faculty, said young starting out families, And I said, well, where do those kids go to school? Oh, down the road at, Wilson Elementary or whatever it is. I don't know. I said, well, how many of the teachers there have been trained either by you all or anyone else on how to educate young children in an anti-racist fashion? Of course, none had. Just like Dubuque, all of the other support structures within the community hadn't been brought on board with this mission. So what does that mean? It means you can bring people into a community, and you should. You should do that outreach and recruitment, and you should. You should jiggle those evaluation standards to make them both more fair and more relevant. You should. But once you get people here, you got to remember that folks can come and still not feel comfortable because they can feel so isolated, and they'll get up and roll out, and then people will say, see, they just couldn't cut it. Whether it was students or whether it was faculty, and then people like Thomas Sowell and other critics of affirmative action will write things where they say, see, there's a mismatch between the students and the school and the faculty and the school. They're going to schools that they're not really qualified for, and their test scores prove it. That's not what happened. What happened was the environment once people got there, right, of isolation. People of color in rooms as students, for example, who one of 1, 1 of 2, 1 of 3 people of color. Every time race comes up, all eyes on them. The assumption being that all the black kids in the room can speak for black people. All the Asian folks sent out an email last week where they said, now look, y'all, if the white people want to know about this, here's what we're going to say for at least the next month. You might want to check back, but this is our line for August. Nobody ever asked white people to speak for white people. But people of color regularly feel that burden of representation, that knowledge that even if it's not about race, any discussion they're involved in, it could be in any kind of class. It could be in a biology class. It could be in a calculus class. If there's a question asked and they raise their hand and get the answer wrong, it's a little bit different experience than when a white person does the same thing. For that person of color, that may be an intimidation that actually prevents them from participating at the same level in class, even when they know the material. The research is clear on that, just like it is with gender. Research in engineering programs in particular has found that women who are heavily outnumbered in engineering programs, oftentimes they might be in a classroom, it's a math class or a science class, that they're just outnumbered, 5 to 1, 10 to 1. And what the research suggests is that those women, even though they're obviously good at science and math, they want to be engineers. They're not just taking this for fun. Nobody takes these advanced classes for fun. They're doing it because they can do the work. They have the ability to do it. But the classroom participation rates are very low, and it's directly contingent on how many women are in the room. It's an exponential increase. The more women in the room, the more participation on the part of the students. The fewer women in the room, the fewer. Why? Because that burden of carrying that representation on one's shoulders, that fear of confirming a negative stereotype, is operating with non-dominant group members in a way that it's not for others. Now that research has expanded into the world of faculty as well, and into the larger job market outside the world of higher education. And it's a body of research known by the phrase stereotype threat. Let me tell you what it means so you understand what the research suggests. I'm sure some of you are familiar with it, others maybe not. It's one of the most important things that we can understand in higher education, particularly as we continue to chip away at affirmative action programs, whether it's in Michigan, as happened the other day, or whether it's what the Supreme Court is likely to do in this term, and if not this term, certainly sometime soon. We have to understand some of these issues so that we can plan and plot strategies that will address the attack on diversity and equity that's currently underway. Stereotype threat research started out about, 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, but really has come into its own in the last decade. And it was has been pioneered by Claude Steele, who's the head of the psych department at Stanford. He and his colleagues at Stanford, now there have been others at other schools that have followed it up at Berkeley and University of Texas and a few other places. But Stanford's really the place that's most known for it. What he and his colleagues were concerned about, by the way, Claude Steele is the brother of Shelby Steele, the black conservative who thinks racism doesn't exist anymore. He and his brother don't speak for reasons that will be very obvious to you in just a second. Claude Steele, who's actually a social scientist, unlike his brother, has done research on the area, and what he wanted to research at the time was why it seemed to be true, and it is true, that African American kids, and they've since done it with more than just black and white, but they started out with black and white, why it is that African American children from affluent families, right, where you had two parents in the home, $70,000 or more a year in annual income, both parents had college degrees, high emphasis placed on schooling within the home, nonetheless were scoring lower on the SAT and every other standardized test that you can name than white students who came from families with less than $12,000 a year. Because indeed that's true. Poor white students do better on every single standardized test than affluent African American students. And the reason they found this interesting is that the theories that had been coming out of progressive education circles had typically been that it was a resource deprivation issue, that if you were lower income, you'd have less resources, and that was the reason. Well, that does explain some of the difference. There's absolutely no doubt about that, between white students and black students, and between some black students and other black students, and between some white students and other white students. There's definitely a direct correlation between income and SAT score in the aggregate. But what's interesting is that even with that aggregate correlation, the relationship is somewhat inverted with regard to race and class, because low-income whites still do better on the test than high-income black folks. And of course, they logically rejected the two most obvious conservative arguments here. One would be the bell curve argument that, black folks are just biologically inferior. But aside from the scientific absurdity of the claim, which we haven't the time to go into here, of course, but putting aside the scientific absurdity of the claim, there's also the simple fact that even if you believed it to be generally a true claim, which is silly, you certainly couldn't apply such an appellation to people who are making $70,000 a year or more and are very successful. Clearly, they ain't the ones with the damaged DNA. They're not the ones who are genetically defective because they're doing pretty well. Right? So they don't fit the bell curve model. And then the other right-wing argument would be, well, it's not genes, it's culture. They're culturally defective. But these are people who are succeeding in mainstream culture, so it can't be that, right? So the only other option they had a theory. Their theory was that when you're a member of a stigmatized group against which there are very pernicious stereotypes about which you were intimately aware, and with which you were intimately familiar from a very early age. And indeed, the research says, for example, that black kids are fully aware of the negative stereotypes held about them in most cases by the age of 9, sometimes quite a bit sooner than that, certainly by the time they're teenagers. If you know about these negative stereotypes, even if you know they're wrong, Even if you know they're flawed, even if you have a lot of confidence and your family's successful and has bred you to be successful, you still know that when you're in a competitive environment, taking that test against others, in that job interview against others, taking that SAT against others, that if you don't do well, the risk is that it will be viewed through the lens of a group defect. In other words, the people doing the evaluation, it may confirm the stereotypes that you think they have, and simply knowing that that can happen, simply knowing that your performance may end up saying something bad about the group from which you come is a huge additional stress for someone who's trying to compete in an academic environment of competitiveness. And so when those students take that test, they're taking a very different test. Now, how did they prove this to be true? Because they did indeed prove it, and not a shred of research has contradicted it to date. What they did was they took white students and black students, all of whom were A and B students, and then once they got them all high quality, all good in the classroom, they separated them randomly at that point into 2 different rooms. Each room had white students and black students in it. They gave them the exact same standardized exam. In the first room, they gave them an instruction prior to taking the test, something along the lines of this. This is paraphrased, but it's fairly close. This is a test of your ability. It's going to determine how prepared you are to go on to the next level. Good luck. In other words, pretty much what you think is really going to go down when you take one of these. Like, oh my God, it's going to count. My whole future is dependent on it. A lot of pressure. In the second room, they gave them the very same questions, equally qualified students, indistinguishable academically from the ones over here. But they gave them a different instruction. They told them, this is not a test of your cognitive ability. We're not even going to grade it. We're just going to observe the different way that different people take tests. Something innocuous like that. Doesn't mean anything. So over here, they don't even think it's going to be evaluated. There's going to be no grade given, so there's no pressure. What do you think happens? In this room, the black students bomb the test by 1 to 1.5 standard deviations from the mean, the very same as the difference in the real world. Over here, where there's no stress, no pressure, it isn't even going to be graded. You're not worried about living down to or confirming a negative stereotype. You're not worried about disproving a negative stereotype. You don't have to do anything except just answer the questions to the best of your ability. The white students do the same in either room, but there is a huge increase for African American students, and by the end of the test, there is no statistically significant difference in outcomes between white students and black students. None. They did it over and over and over and over again. Then they did it with men and women on a math exam, because what's the stereotype there? We all know the stereotype. It's a stereotype that's so common that you can be the president of Harvard, at least for a little while. Blessedly not forever. And still believe that it might be true that women just aren't as good at science and math naturally. This, in spite of all the evidence which demonstrates that on a global level, women are pretty much equally represented with men in many countries. It's only in the West that that's not the case, so the idea that it's genetic or biological seems a bit unscientific in the extreme, but you can believe it, and a lot of people do. And women, even though women know it's not true in most cases, women who are very good at math and very good at science certainly know that a lot of men think it's true. So when they sit down in that room to take that math exam and they're told it counts, they bomb the test. The gaps are a little bit smaller than the racial gaps, but they still manifest. Over here, where they're told there's no difference in the outcomes. They've done it with whites and Asians. Now what happens? Because now what's the stereotype? Oh my God, all Asians are good at math. This is nonsensical. As anyone who is Asian can tell you, there are plenty of folks in their own family, perhaps themselves, who are not good at math, not good at science, cannot fix your computer, nor do they desire to do so. And yet we have these ridiculous stereotypes about them. And so you put white students over here with the Asian kids, give them a calculus exam. Oh, no, no, no. The white students flip out. I'm taking a calculus exam against Koreans. I'm completely screwed. And so they bomb. Over here, you tell them there's no difference, and again, there is no difference in the outcomes that is statistically significant. Some of Steele's colleagues have now done this with basketball. Take white ball players and black ball players, all of whom are good, all of whom play on an actual team. Have the white guys play the black guys. On court one, tell them that it is a test of natural athletic ability. Over here, tell them it's a test of the skills they've developed as a result of practice. Now, what do you think happens? Over here, the white guys, man, they cannot pass, they cannot dribble, they cannot shoot. They get blown off the court. Because why? They got that thing in their mind about natural, oh my God, natural athletic ability. I'm sure I heard somewhere that black people have like an extra femur and a spring in their ankle and more fast twitch muscle fibers than white people. None of this is accurate, by the way, but a lot of people believe it. There have actually been specials on NBC News where they actually gave voice to this nonsense. all of which has now been discredited, most of which have been discredited by the time the special came out. But, the liberal media, the liberal media always likes to push egalitarianism under the guise of scientific racism. But anyway, so over here, the white guys get blown off the court. Over here, games are always tight, right? White guys win approximately half the time. What all of this suggests is that when stereotypes are out there, even if you don't hold them, this is why this is so important to understand, even if you're not holding them, the mere knowledge on the part of their targets that they exist and that you might hold them, unless they are really sure that you don't, there's a default position to which the target's mind will go quite rationally, quite understandably, which is, this person may feel this way about folks like me. And to the extent that that's possible, their performance may be less than their actual ability. And if you don't know that, you're not going to be evaluating people accurately, right? Whether it's an admissions officer, whether it's a teacher in a classroom that, sees that maybe their students of color don't participate as much in the discussions. If they don't understand how stereotype threat may be intimidating those folks from speaking, right, then they don't know how to really evaluate. They think they're less qualified, less prepared. If you're doing a faculty search, and the same thing happens now on interviews for the reasons I gave voice to earlier, that if you know that messing up in that interview might actually be seen through the lens of group stereotype, that can be intimidating and drive down your performance in the interview itself. And at the end of the day, the person doing the evaluation will say, I just think Joe over here fits better. That whole concept of somebody fits in better is such a subjective thing, but you hear it all the time. And so we need to understand stereotype threat so that we can take action against it. There are things you can do, by the way, to minimize the likelihood of stereotype threat, especially in the classroom. All the research, and Steele's done some of it, he's written about it widely. There's a book called Young, Gifted, and Black that he co-edited with Asa Hilliard, and it wasn't Lisa Delpit. I can't remember who the third editor was. But his piece in particular was really good because he talks about stereotype threat. Young, Gifted, and Black is the name of the book. He talks about stereotype threat and how you can undermine it. Some of the research is really fascinating on this. There isn't a lot that you have to do to undermine it and make it more equitable in the classroom. Some of the things can be quite small. For example, several years ago, a calculus professor by the name of Philip Treisman, who was at Berkeley at the time, right, noticed something very interesting going on in his calc labs. He noticed that the Asian and the white students were all doing much better than the black students. And this was true in spite of the fact that he knew the black students were good at math. He'd seen their backgrounds. He knew they'd all been good at math in high school, but they just weren't doing well in the exams relative to whites and Asians. And he just didn't understand what was going on, so he started paying real close attention, and he noticed that the white and the Asian students were almost always studying in teams, and the black students were studying alone, almost every time. Right, doing it all on their own. And so he asked why that was, and what he found was that the reason, at least implicit in what black folks were often doing, was there was this sort of attitude of, I've got to do it on my own. This is my work. It's almost like thinking that if you work in groups, it's like you're cheating or something, right? That you're not really cutting it, that you're not really doing it. And the white and the Asian students weren't tripping on this because they weren't worried that somebody was going to think they couldn't do it. There was no stereotype that they were worried about, so subconsciously there's nothing to pressure the white folks to study alone because I've got to prove myself. But the black students felt like they really had to prove to the world, to their family, to the teacher, to the colleagues in class that they could do it. And so Treisman made one very simple change. He said, from now on, everybody in this calc lab has to study in teams. And it wasn't like the white team, the black team, the Asian, it wasn't like Survivor, But the idea was we're going to study in teams because that's a better technique. Why? And he wasn't using the language of stereotype threat at the time. This was actually before the term I think was even being used, but it was the same concept. The idea was once you took the pressure off of the person to have to represent, to have to carry all the weight on their own shoulders, and instead spread that burden around. So you're responsible for this piece, you're responsible for this piece, I got to know this piece, we'll all help each other learn it, right? Elementary teachers call this jigsaw learning. We're going to work together on a project, and we don't have to all know everything. We just all got to do our little piece of the pie and bring it together for one comprehensive whole. That one little change, at the end of the year, the black students were outperforming the white and the Asian students in that class, just with one little change. Georgia Tech had a program for many years. They've had to modify it now for fear of a lawsuit on the basis of so-called reverse discrimination. But the program they had for many years took students of color who were coming in a little bit less quote-unquote qualified in terms of test scores, giving them a 5-week challenge class in calculus prior to the enrollment fall of freshman year. The idea being that they weren't quite as prepared, they hadn't had the same opportunity through no fault of their own, but they had real promise and real potential. They would bring them in, give them 5 weeks of intense bombardment of hard material, not remediation, Not remediation, which starts with a deficit model, right? The idea that you're damaged and we have to fix you. This was not assuming they were damaged. In fact, the message of this program was the system is damaged. The system didn't give you what you need. We're going to do it and you can make it. A very different kind of mindset. And after 5 weeks of being bombarded with stuff these kids had never seen before, calculus, over this, their heads are here and it's about right here. But they rose to the occasion. At the end of the year, they were doing better than other students at Georgia Tech who had been admitted through normal, quote-unquote, meritocratic means. So what it suggests is that we can create classroom environments, we can create campus environments, especially if we reach out to the larger community and we get other folks involved in that process. Because again, you all could do everything right in this school in terms of recruitment, admission, evaluation standards, classroom management techniques. You could do everything right, and yet, if folks of color come and they feel uncomfortable in the larger community, then it can undermine everything that the school does. So it's got to be a joint effort. It can't be just one or two institutions. It's got to be this school saying, hey, this is what we're going to be about, and we want you to be about this too, meaning the business community. We want the K through 12 schools to be about this too, and we'll work together. We'll have programs together, try to separate, knock down this separation between town and gown that often happens in college towns, right? Trying to break down that wall, break down those barriers and say, you have to be a part of this because you being a part of it helps us fulfill our purpose and our mission, which brings me then to the last thing I want to mention about what we have to do beyond really looking critically at our evaluation standards and our classroom management techniques and the degree of isolation, all these things I've talked about previously. It seems to me when schools want to know what to do, although I understand the question, I do find it odd because it seems to me that schools ought to already know what to do by just looking at their mission statements. This institution, like every other college, with the exception apparently of Pomona College, which oddly enough doesn't have a mission statement. I know why they don't have one. I was told it was because they didn't want to box themselves in to a particular mission. They were quite content to just be the top-ranked liberal arts college in the United States, according to the always accurate U.S. News and World Report. So they were quite happy when I was there at Pomona. They just had their median SAT score was a 1430. And that was actually higher than any Ivy League school, higher than really any liberal arts college I've ever heard of. And that was all. Their mission was that. But there was no mission statement. But I know you all have one, and I know that virtually all state institutions do, and really everybody but Pomona has one. And what's interesting is, when you ask somebody what their mission statement is, I've only found one person in all the years that I've been asking that question who actually can repeat it. I only have met a few people who've even really looked at it since they came to the school. And I found almost no one who's ever actually had a plan for operationalizing it. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is if you have a mission statement that is the definition of why you exist, it is the description of your purpose. And if that mission statement is like most and has all of this flowery rhetoric, and I know it does. Just like I know the website's got more black and brown folk on them than really exist, I know the mission statement has more beautiful words in it that actually manifest in terms of policy, practice, and procedure. I haven't looked at yours in the 5 years since I first came here, but I'm sure it's beautiful because all schools' mission statements are. They talk about the need to create lifelong learners in a global environment, sometimes, right, even about committed to diversity in a global environment, to meet the challenges of the future. How close am I? I figure I'm pretty damn close. Some of them even mention social justice. A few, not many, Jesuit schools and a handful of others. They mention that. They have a commitment, right? But they all imply a commitment to equity and diversity, whether they say it explicitly, and a lot of them do, but even if they don't say it explicitly, it's clearly implied by the mission statement. It's clearly the underlying logic, and yet there are very few schools that have begun to think about how they could operationalize it. What do I mean by that? I mean very simply that if you're going to have a mission statement that defines the purpose for existing, it seems to me that every policy, every procedure, every practice on that campus should go toward the ends of that mission, and anything that contradicts that end should be eliminated, which is to say that if you want to be a member of this community, this or any other community of higher education, that you either demonstrate a commitment to that mission or you do not come. In other words, yes, I'm saying that in order to be a student of a college or university, one of the things you ought to be asked before you get in, irrespective of your test scores, your grades, your letters of recommendation, or whether daddy went there, is here is the reason we exist. What does this mean to you? How have you lived this commitment previously in your life? What have you done in league with this commitment? And what will you do once you are here? And if you don't have a good answer, there are lots of other schools you can go to. And if you lied to us and get in, that's fine. But before we let you graduate, you will demonstrate a commitment to this mission. And if you don't, you will not finish here. There are plenty of schools to which you can transfer, which then brings us to faculty and staff. Because if you want to teach at an institution that has this mission, I want to know what that mission means to you, how you have lived the commitment to that mission in your previous professional experience, and how you intend to do it now. And if you cannot answer it, there are lots of other schools where you can teach. And if you get into that job because you lied and made it sound like it was the most important thing in your life, and then you do not, over the period of 4 or 5 years, demonstrate a commitment to it in your particular discipline or on the campus as a whole, there are lots of other places you can seek tenure, but this will not be the place for you. And people say, well, that's a litmus test. Yeah, it is. It's called a mission statement. That's the reason you're there. You would not join a church that you fundamentally disagreed with, nor would they want you. Why would you seek to join an institution of higher learning with which you fundamentally disagree? And if folks don't like the mission because it's too liberal, too progressive, too radical, then right-wingers can set up their own schools. They got the money if they want to do it. They want to set up a mission that just says, we just want to have a bunch of white people with a whole lot of money. They can do it. And if you want your mission to be, you know what? I mean, because what are the policies? You know, the thing, I was on 2020 last week, and one of the segments before my segment was this thing about schools that let in the children of well-connected, wealthy folks, even though their grades are terrible. They call them developmental admits, right? This idea that, well, they're really not qualified to be here, but they're going to bring us a lot of money. That's not the mission. The mission didn't say our mission is to bring in people who will help us build buildings in 15 years. That's not the mission. That's not the reason the school exists. And so anything that does that, that's not the reason for which it doesn't say our purpose is to bring in the folks with the highest test scores and the best grades and the best research. That's not the mission. The mission does not say our goal is to go up the U.S. News and World Report rankings every year. But that's what schools obsess about in most cases. So we got to think about how, and I can't tell you how you operationalize it, but it seems to me that every policy, every practice, every procedure in the institution should be subjected to that single evaluation standard, which is, how does this help us live our mission? Or how does it get in the way of living our mission? And if this policy, practice, or procedure does not fit in with the purpose for which we have announced we exist, it goes. And if we're not ready to do that, then we are not serious about moving beyond diversity. We are not serious about creating equity. We are not serious about fundamentally transforming the institution. And here's the other way I know that, and then I'm going to take questions. I do these workshops, and y'all are lucky that you had too many people, because I'd have done it here. Sometimes when I have workshops, I'll come in late, and I'll make myself all out of breath. Like I'll go run around the building before I come in. And then I'll come in out of breath, and I'll have like a piece of paper, and I won't show them what it is, you know. I'll wave it, and I'm really excited. And I come in, and I say, I'm sorry I'm late. Great news. I just got off the phone. That's why I'm late. I was back at the hotel. I just got this fax, and it's from an organization that just had a press conference at the National Press Club in Washington. It's a group of people of color who were very wealthy, a group of like 20 black and Latino and Asian millionaires or whatever, and they've just had a press conference, where they announced that, unbeknownst to anyone, they have been scouring the country looking for what they thought was the best school for black and brown kids to go to for college. And they've looked and they've looked. They kept it very secret, and they have decided that it's your school. And listen, here's the good. They are prepared to spend their own money. It's not going to cost you a penny. They're going to spend their own money to convince, depending on the size of the school, I'll say 500 or 100 or 50. I mean, the smaller, the lower the number. But like with some schools, if it's really big, 500 of the best and the brightest black and brown kids in the country. Only the ones with the top scores. Only the ones with the best grades. Only the ones with the best references and recommendations and merit indicators, and get them to come here instead of these other schools that they might go to. And they're going to get free rides, and it won't cost you anything. 500 new black and brown kids. It'll double your percentage of students of color for next year. And they're all brilliant. What do you think? And they always go, can I see that paper? They look at each other, puzzled, confused, and just a little bit scared. They're not jumping out of there. If it was me, I'd be like, holy crap, you're kidding. I'm sorry, I got to leave the workshop and go call this is wonderful. But they never do that. It's always, well, now, hold on just a minute. Now, what are the strings? No strings, man. It's free. Won't cost you anything at all, and they are going to pay for it, and it's only going to be the best and the brightest. It will raise your median SAT score by 100 points. You'll be even more elite. You'll probably move up in the U.S. News rankings. And they still aren't buying it. Why? Because they know that if the numbers of black and brown folk double, there are going to be some white parents going to come and say, I'm not sure this is a place for my child anymore. There are going to be some alums that are going to raise hell because it's not going to be the place that they went. Alums raise hell when you change like the mascot or even talk about it like at Illinois. Can't do that. Right? So what it suggests to me is we have to be really honest. How much diversity do we really want? Do HWCUs really want 30%, 35%, 40%? Do they really want the numbers to represent what the nation itself is going to look like in 30 or 40 years? Let's stop kidding ourselves, man. Elephants are going to be elephants. Muskrats are going to be muskrats. Lions are going to be lions. The question is not whether we can take an elephant and make it into a lion or a muskrat and make it into an elephant, changing fundamentally the very purpose of the institution, but we can at least say, at the very least, that however that institution is going to operate, we're going to make sure that it's equitable for all those who were there. The odds of such a school becoming 5, 10 times more diverse than it currently is, probably not going to happen, but that has nothing to do with equity. Equity is an imperative. The mission statement says it is an imperative, and everything we do ought to be toward that end, and nothing that we do should contradict it. And with that, I will end my time of preaching to you and happily take questions that you have. Thank you very much and take care.
Questions? Okay.
Over here. But first you must ask me why I'm dancing, Mildred. Because I dare to be different. Okay, we're talking about diversity.
Question.
Dare to be different. First of all, I wanted to say to you, Tim, that was a marvelous, marvelous talk. I really enjoyed it, and I think you just made your points eloquently, and I hope it reached everybody out here, because your words are wise like your name. So thank you very much. Thank you for coming and touching us today. My question is, and I guess I more kind of want to help generate a discussion because, and I'm sure that's your intention as well, I happen to also teach classes. I don't know those of you who, if you don't know me, I'm Nancy Farber, and I teach in the Department of Counseling and Student Development. And one of the classes I teach is cross-cultural counseling, talking about all these issues that Tim has raised this afternoon, issues of oppression and, inequality and all that, and looking at that and how that impacts how we see each other. And one of the things that has come up for me with my students in terms of their growth edges and challenges, and when I say students, I mean students of life, every single person I come into contact, not just the people in my classroom, is that what underlies the racist experience for all of us is fear. Just fear of difference. I was out with Mildred one night, right? We were out in Rocks, and this young woman walks right by. We're sitting there at the table. She walks right by. Walks right by. Finally, Mildred says to me, Nance, what's going on here? And I'm like, wow, something's going on here. Because I've eaten at Rocks a lot in the past 4.5 years, and I love that place. Some young girl, probably not even aware of it. Most of us, we're not aware of it. It's unconscious. So I guess what I hope, and I don't want to step on your toes at all, but just knowing my peers and knowing the culture here, what it's like here, I guess I just want everyone to talk about their fears. Just get out in the open. So that's what I'm hoping for. So thank you.
Okay, you want to address that? How do you deal with perhaps fears?
I'd be happy to have anyone in the room speak to that. I would just say one thing before anyone does that, though, if you want to, because I think it's a great idea. I think fear is a pretty significant motivator an underlying factor with regard to racism. I would only say that I think the fear, perhaps in my opinion at least, is less the fear of difference per se, and I think really it's more a fear of losing power. And I think there's a real social power dynamic that is at the root of it. And a lot of times people don't realize that's what it is they're afraid of. They made themselves experience it as fear of difference. But I honestly believe, and a lot of folks disagree with me about this, but I really do believe that when it comes to race, I think white Americans actually know a lot more than we let on about what's gone down. We sometimes act like we're very innocent and naive and don't know anything, and we're shocked whenever we see them. And to some extent, that denial is pure and it's real and it's true. But I think some of it is also willed ignorance in the sense that there's some stuff that we know in the back of our mind, just like white South Africans knew in the back of their mind what had really gone down. And I think there's a real fear of change, more so than difference in itself, because change is seen as threatening everything that that group of people knows and has gotten used to. There's a really interesting new book out, and I've only gotten a little bit of the way into it, called There Goes My Everything. And it's a book about white Southerners in the civil rights era who weren't necessarily the bigots. They weren't the ones who were out shouting at the kids, desegregating Little Rock Central. And they certainly weren't the white folks who were in the civil rights movement. They were sort of in between that, just average, everyday folks who passively participated in the system and were really worried that there goes my everything. There goes everything that I know and have grown accustomed to. And I think that fear is even scarier than the fear of difference, if that's really what it is, because the fear of difference you can overcome. There's cognitive tools you can use and that psychologists and therapists use to get you over any fear of the unknown, whether it's a fear of snakes, a fear of bugs, a fear of heights, a fear of whatever. You can do that. There are therapy methods. But the fear of social change and losing power, man, that's a deeper thing that we're going to have a really serious conversation about. Tonight, the talk I'm going to give this evening is going to speak to some of the ways that I think we can begin to address that fear. And actually, to me, the only method that works is at some level it has to be demonstrated to the people who are privileged, whether it's race privilege, gender privilege, privilege on the basis of class, sexual orientation, or any other, that those privileges come at a huge cost, and that in fact, the consequences of that privilege, even though the privilege is quite real in relative terms, that the absolute consequences can be disastrous even for the people with privilege. It seems to me that we want to move the fear to a different thing. I'm not one of these people that says, the politics of fear are bad. Fear is fine as long as you're scared of the stuff you need to be afraid of. But if you're afraid that your neighbor is a member of an Al-Qaeda sleeper cell, you're probably barking up the wrong tree, and that's not a logical, rational fear. But a rational fear of what inequality and white privilege is going to do to the planet, that one makes sense to me, and I'll speak to that one this evening. But if anybody else wants to chime in on the fear issue, whether it's fear of difference, fear of change, maybe classroom experiences that you've had that confirm that, or your own experiences and how you work with it and how you speak to it, that'd be great.
Hello. I don't know if this is, can you hear me now?
I can. I don't know if they can. Is it not working?
Hello. Okay, my name is Maurice Tracy. I'm a grad student here. And my question is more, I write for the Daily Eastern News. I write a column that runs twice a month. And I get a lot of flack about it. And it's more of a two-part question because I also saw your thing on 2020. And the thing I found most interesting about this, which goes along with my question, is out of all the segments, it was called Privilege in America. And they conceded with every single segment that there is privilege until it came to your segment. And that's when they did bring out Shelby Steele to say it's not about white privilege, it's about black and therefore minority responsibility. And I wrote a column a couple of weeks back about this Facebook group called 1 Million White Students. And I'm wondering, how do you confront that when you do bring up to somebody there is a thing as white privilege and they don't want to hear it? And then on the other hand, in one of my graduate classes the other night, we were discussing the canon, because I'm a literature student. And most of the people in my class are liberals, but the thing that really struck me was just this blind liberal type of racism. So how do you deal with those two things, especially whenever I voice it, I'm automatically accused of you're just being the black gay person that's all you care about, basically, then. So how do you deal with that?
Right. Well, there's a couple things in there. The first thing, let me just speak to the 2020 real quick. Right, that the only segment where they really did any effort to debunk the notion was the white privilege segment. Although I will tell you, I was actually very pleased with the segment as it came out. And I'll tell you why. Because I knew going in that this was John Stossel. And Stossel is horrible on these issues. He considers himself a libertarian, but libertarian views on race and racism tend to be that it's not really a problem, and if it is, the market can solve it, and all this silly nonsense. But so I knew going in there was risk, but the producer assured me that they would do it fairly. And although I wish they hadn't given Shelby Steele the last word, and I gave them 12 minutes of rebuttal to Shelby Steele in the interview, none of which they used, because it was ABC, because it was John Stossel, the fact that the first 5 minutes before they even got to Shelby was, well, Chris Rock doing his bit, which was cool, and then me, and then they talked about the 3 or 4 studies they had done themselves, which had confirmed white privilege, right? So the first 5 minutes is basically, yeah, this definitely exists. Then they went to Shelby, but the good thing about it was at the very end what Stossel said, and for him, this was monumental, right? The last going away line is, so white privilege exists, but maybe it's not the whole story. Okay, fine, that's fine. I'm okay with that. That's it. Like, if that's all I can get out of John Stossel, I'm happy with it. Because if you watch the actual segment, you would definitely know the data, the evidence was clear. And what Shelby Steele was speaking to has nothing to do with white privilege. This is what I tried to tell Stossel. He wanted me to get in an argument about whether black people were responsible enough. I said, we could spend hours on it, and I think he's wrong. But even if I thought Shelby Steele were right, what does it have to do with my responsibility to deal with white privilege? Especially if Shelby Steele is going to be the apostle of personal responsibility, or if Bill Cosby is going to be, or if Thomas Sowell is going to be, or if other black conservatives are going to say, we need to take personal responsibility. Cool. Where does that leave me? What am I responsible for? Oktoberfest and the St. Patty's Day parade? What the hell? Like personal responsibility means white folks got to deal with our 2 dimes in the quarter, so to speak. And we can't, and for us to sit back and say, yes, black people, do what Shelby Steele says, that's not personal responsibility, that's other responsibility. So it seemed to me it wasn't relevant, and I think that came across to most viewers who I've talked to who saw it, that it wasn't really a rebuttal of what I was saying. It might be true, it might not be true, but it's an independent point. As far as how you deal with people who don't want to hear about it or don't believe it is real, the good thing is, I think, what I've learned, and what I'm going to do this evening in this larger community speech, where it's going to be a much different cross-section of people, a lot of students, I hope, that maybe haven't been initiated into this and might be among those who are more resistant to the concept. What I try and do is I start off by telling personal story. It's the reason that I wrote the book that I wrote, White Like Me, which I'll be happy to sell you if you want one. It's my little plug for my children's college education fund. And in the book, what I tried to do, the whole point, and what I'll do this evening, is start off by telling a story about myself, which demonstrates the way white privilege operates and how it helps people, even white folks who aren't wealthy, because I certainly wasn't, who don't have money, because we certainly didn't, but how it nonetheless has shaped the very track that I have been on throughout my life, and then talk about how that's true for all. And what I've found is that when you tell a personal story, it actually is the best way to ease into this conversation. It's one thing to just hit people with a bunch of data that aren't ready for it, because folks will always dispute your data. They don't want to hear data. They can always say, you can make numbers say anything. Actually, you can't. 2 + 2 is going to equal 4 every day, but you definitely, it's true that statistics can be manipulated, and so I'm sort of glad that there's a cynicism of that, about that. But so I think if you tell a story that actually demonstrates how it's worked in your own life, and you challenge other people to think, how does that apply to you? Or maybe it doesn't, but tell me about your life. I've yet to meet the white person who, if I ask them enough about their life, where they're from, who their parents are, what their folks did, where they went to school, what jobs their parents had, I've yet to find the white person who's been in this country for more than a second, who I cannot demonstrate as a recipient of white privilege. I don't go out of my way to do that. It's not like I walk up to people in the mall and, give them a quiz. But I'm just saying, white folks who don't want to hear it, if you tell your own story, sometimes it connects with them instead of being seen as well, here, you're an idiot, and here's all the data, and here's the facts. It's like, no, here's what happened to me. You tell me how your life differs, and then we can have a conversation about it and see if it applies or see if it doesn't. I think storytelling is usually the best way to do that. And I think question asking is the other way. If people are blocking a conversation, asking them questions to get them to the truth you want them to see, it's usually a better mechanism for the uninitiated and the unwilling than the didactic, here's what you need to believe method.
Hi, I'm Penka Skachkova, and I'm the coordinator of the Women's Studies program here on the campus. And as probably many of you know, but just would like also to inform our speaker, we already started the initiative to look at the academic climate on the campus for minorities and for women. And our way of doing that was by reading academic murder mysteries, without suggesting that murder is the only way to solve racism, sexism, and all the other isms, but at least we approached these very tense and very controversial issues in a more entertaining way. And you did mention about the fact that many campuses have been made efforts to diversify their campuses, their membership with faculty and students from diverse background, national origin included, especially after September 11th, when many foreigners felt like strangers or not wanted in this country and expelled, fired, and deported. However, despite bringing more numbers of women and minorities to the campuses around the whole country, one especially important point that is missing is the quality of those numbers. The question, are the numbers enough? Is it important only to bring 500 African American students or 500 women? Or are we looking for what kind of groups they represent? Or whether they really feel that they represent the groups that they had been thought that they're representing. And quite often, on a daily experience, we could feel that there are token representatives that don't link to their groups on the campuses, women's studies, ethnic studies, gay and lesbian communities, and so forth. And then the numbers don't talk much. And they're a very good statistic for affirmative action and all the other reports. But at the same time, they don't bring any quality to the climate on the campus. So I'm speaking of the climate on the campus and speaking something about what radical feminists, anti-racist activists have been done for so many years is not to quit, not to go in exile, not to drop the university, not to drop a class if you disagree with the policy or the politics of your professor, not to leave the university, not to leave the country, but to stay with it and to stay within the campus and try to develop alliances and try to do some work that will make this place much a better place for people from diverse backgrounds. So the question which I have, and this is a question to all of us here, is what we can really carry on from that lecture and from this presentation today, what we can really do on the campus, and what practical measures would you suggest that we can really carry on and really develop after you leave? Because I don't think that one lecture, one presentation, although it is very important, and I really congratulate you for your brilliant presentation, and I read your book, but the point is, so what? What we can do afterwards? Is one lecture enough? Does one bird make a spring? And the question is also that not just everyone of us to leave this meeting and think, oh, we fulfilled another responsibility, and we went and we heard this great speaker, but what kind of developments we can really do, and what kind of developments will follow this lecture, and what kind of measures everybody who is here in this campus could be responsible to undertake.
Mildred, you want to take a stab at that?
I have Dean Augustine and several faculty leaders who have already been identified. We have a gentleman from Parkland. We have the assistant superintendent who's agreed, Dara Taylor. We are going to have small learning communities in the spring. So our conversations will continue on diversity. So we will get out a mass email about the small learning communities that will be started in the spring. I do agree, one-time shot is not enough, but we have already started planning for small learning communities. Thank you, Pinka.
A few things to it real
Sure.
quickly. In addition to the stuff I talked about before, which is really looking at how to operationalize the mission statement and several things on that nature, I think in addition to that, it's really important that you start building the cadre of people who are committed to these principles, because like you said, it's one thing to have the bodies that represent certain groups, but it's another thing to necessarily have those folks really connected to the climate that you're wanting to create, because especially if you're a member of an isolated quote-unquote minority group, whatever that might be, it's very likely, as I talked about in the speech, that you're not going to necessarily be empowered enough to speak up when you see things. There's actually a body of research on that suggests that folks who are isolated tend to stuff the experiences that they do have, and so they don't speak out. And if they don't speak out, then it's very hard for the climate to be challenged, because a lot of times then the people at the top act like nothing's happening because they never heard any complaints and they never heard anyone speak out about racism and sexism and heterosexism and all these things. So clearly, the small learning communities can be one method of helping to empower folks to speak up. It can also really help create allies within the dominant group culture, so that you get white allies coming out of that who are prepared to stand up with people of color. You get male allies who are prepared to step up with women. You get straight allies who are prepared to step up for LGBT folk. And so that can come out of that. But in addition to it, I think you've got to see to it that anyone who's coming into the institution new, and that is to say, it could be you do this at first year orientation with students, you do it for new faculty. I know it's hard to make tenured faculty do anything that they don't want to do, I understand. You can't do anything to them unless they're Ward Churchill, and then you can get them fired, or try to. But for new folk, y'all that haven't gotten tenure yet, or before you did, they can make you do anything they want. And I think one of the things that we ought to make sure of is that those folks coming in new are being acculturated to the ideas that we're talking about here. Using the mission statement's one method, but also going beyond that, because it's usually, even though it's a pretty statement, it's not as thoroughgoing as it needs to be, and really making it clear that these are the principles we need to be talking about. There are not many schools that do this, but I've been very heartened the last couple of years. I just got back from Chicago I was there a week and a half ago, and I spent the whole week at Northwestern talking to every member of the first-year class, 400 students a day for 5 days in a row. So you have 2,000 people in the freshman class at Northwestern, many of whom didn't want to hear it, and many of whose parents, I'm sure, didn't want them to hear it, and some of the professors might not have wanted them to, but they all got their introduction to institutional racism and white privilege, and they're all now going to have these conversations, and they're going to be starting out on a similar page. They're going to have different opinions. They're not all going to agree, but they were all subjected to it. Kalamazoo College did the same thing recently, and I know people who have done this at both state institutions and private schools. The idea being that you can at least see to it that from the very outset we're going to set a certain tone. Doesn't mean you always have to agree with everything we're saying, but we're going to set a tone. That way the folks know that it's not just because what was interesting was talking to some of the students of color that were in that freshman class about how much easier it was going to be now to raise some of these issues. It would have been much harder. But now that it's been talked about and everybody's been subjected to it, they feel like they won't be quite as isolated. So, yeah.
I've got the mic. Yes. I have the mic. I have the microphone. I'm Norman Greer. I'm associate professor in the Communication Studies Department, and I teach intercultural communication. And one of the things, Tim, may I, that you spoke of that's very true in the U.S. is there's something called the co-construction of both reality and a culture. And in answer to the question about what do we do at Eastern, this is our culture. We're not to be imposed or enacted upon, but to co-construct what is the culture of Eastern Illinois University here in Charleston. And one of the misconceptions about the U.S. culture is that somehow from Europe there were some royal families sent to the shores of North America, and that is not true at all. Some people could even grow a potato in Ireland. All you have to do is let the potato seed lie in the ground, and there's someone else who will provide the rain. So I think it is sometimes misleading, and what in social norming is called pluralistic ignorance, when we believe something to be that is in fact not. For example, too much of the U.S. no longer belongs to the United States. So the idea of whiteness as ethnicity and whiteness as a culture of somehow privilege, it's like we celebrate wealth in this country when you have $1 billion and most oil sheiks have at least $3 trillion. Therefore, the level to which you examine the reality becomes that which may or may not be absolutely correct. Our job as members of a unified community is to co-construct what then is the culture of Eastern Illinois University. What does Eastern look like? how does Eastern then match up with the mission statement that we agreed to when we become members of the community? And that's what's important in terms of diversity, yes. Diversity itself, and I love the definitional, the grammatical use, because often we'll take the term racist and make it mean something that is not. IST as a suffix in the English language implies expertise. Most people who are racist, from what is the colloquial term, are not racist, they are bigots, and often it's because of ignorance. To believe that people of color came to the United States as slaves when there were some Moors people here prior to anyone else on the shores of North America is an example of not real brightness. So I think it's important that we, as a community, if it's through small discussion circles, however it is, that we co-construct the culture called Eastern Illinois, which means we look at what are the normative values for our culture, what are primary values for our culture, what are the traditions that we hold and honor, what then and how do we pass those on from generation to generation. One of the things we do in communication studies is we look at not just how do we interpret the message, but how do we also construct that message. Yes, no, my comment was first that in response to the other statements that were made, I thought that we weren't asking questions anymore. Sound like they were all making statements. Did anyone else hear that, or was it me? Oh, okay. I thought I was the only one who heard that. Okay, yeah, I thought I was the only one that heard that for a moment. So my question to you is, in your travels and looking at your statement as it related to, in particular, unstandardized public schooling, there are those in the country now who are actually taking their children out of the public school for the very thing that you spoke of. And in particular, in economically elite African American communities, they are removing their children in record numbers from the public school system for that very reason, because the school system is actually standardizing our students as opposed to teach them how to critically think or how to comprehend, but to remember. And do you find that to be the case in the individuals, the groups, et cetera, that you've been in contact with?
Well, I think it's true. I think the reason that people pull their kids out of public schools is it varies. There are a lot of different reasons. And those reasons can definitely be recently in relation to some of this ridiculous testing, focus, and standardization. But that would be probably what the more progressive among parents are doing. There's still the old-fashioned reasons why folks take their kids, particularly white folks, take their kids out of public schools. They still have to do with fear associated with racial and ethnic diversity, and class diversity, economic diversity. So that's still a big factor too. But I do think that absolutely, this is why I would suggest that the move towards standardization and the rules under No Child Left Behind, people want to understand why. Again, going back to this issue, we think that systems break down because they just aren't working. And I'm suggesting to you, if you believe that No Child Left Behind, was really about saving public schools, you're missing what the architects of No Child Left Behind have said they were about for 20 and 30 years, which is destroying public schools. They don't believe in public schools. They don't send their own kids to public schools, nor would they ever do so. They're really trying to deplete them of people, because that's how you deplete them of support and resources. So if you can have a set of rules that schools can't pass, because these rules are ridiculous. I mean, it's like a 93 is the passing rate. If you get a 92 in this category, you can be put on sanction. So you got schools that are some of the best schools, quote unquote, in terms of outcomes and everything in the country that are on the endangered list, basically getting ready to get taken over because of a set of rules that are absurdly constructed and weren't done by educators. The whole point is to make affluent parents flip out and say, see, it's not working, and they're right, but it's very deliberate. And the idea that it's accidental or they just don't know what they're doing, I think, is the problem. So clearly, I'm of the belief that public schools need to be fundamentally
destroyed and rebuilt. And I don't mean physical plants. I mean the theory behind them. I think public schools currently do not serve a liberatory purpose, nor have they ever done so. They exist to control children and to teach children how to be workers for wealthier people. They exist to replicate the class structure. That is their function, and it always has been. And so until we take it down to the studs and begin over again with a real discussion about what is the purpose of education and schooling, the schools are going to continue in that direction, unfortunately. So I think you're right about why some people are doing it, and I think those of us who want to respond to that critically shouldn't rush to the defense of the schools as they are. That's a huge mistake, because clearly they do not exist for liberation, they exist for control, and the teachers' unions, sadly, and I have many friends who are in them, have become little more than the police unions, which is to say they ain't unions, but they're very good cops.
Well, that brings us to a close for this session. Tim Wise will be, and I want to first of all thank you for being in attendance. I know this was not as interactive as we would have liked, but I do know our conversations really need to continue. I agree with Dr. Norman Greer. It affects not only our campus, but it is a conversation that needs to start on our campus. It needs to continue in our communities. It affects our K-12 schools. But let's give him a round of applause. He has done a wonderful job. Thank you for starting the dialogue. It starts at EIU. And thank you for being in support of the Office of Faculty Development. Great job today. I'll see you tonight. Thank you.